You know, when the state takes away a person's freedom, it also takes on this huge, ultimate responsibility for their life. So what happens when that life actually ends behind bars? That's what we're going to dig into. We'll look at the system that's supposed to find answers, and we'll do it through the story of one of Australia's most infamous killers, and the victims whose stories were almost completely erased.
And that's really the big question, isn't it? It's not just about one single event. It's about a whole process of accountability that gets triggered automatically. It's about how an institution has to answer for a life that's been lost, and maybe more importantly, what we can all learn from it.
All right, so here's our roadmap. First, we'll break down the legal stuff, how this whole process is supposed to work. Then, we're going to open up the case file on the man the media called the Granny Killer, John Wayne Glover. We'll see how his death in prison kicked off the very system we just learned about. And finally, we'll get to what I think is the most important part, rewriting the story to focus on the legacy of his victims. Okay, let's dive in.
So before we jump into any specific case, we really have to understand the rulebook. In Australia, when a death happens in custody, it's not just another case file. It automatically triggers a mandatory investigation called the Coronial Inquest.
And when you look at the legal definition, it's actually incredibly broad, and for a very good reason. We're talking about someone in a prison cell, sure, but also someone in the back of a police car, or even someone who is fatally injured while trying to escape. The law basically casts this huge net to make sure that any death that's even remotely connected to state detention gets a full independent investigation.
This quote from a coroner's report really gets to the heart of it. In the eyes of the law, the responsibility flips. It's no longer just about the individual, it's the institution, whether that's the police or the prison system, that's held accountable. This idea is the bedrock of the whole Coronial Inquest, and it's why these investigations are so absolutely critical.
So how does this all work? Well, it's a pretty systematic process. Step 1, it kicks off with an immediate notification to the state coroner. I mean, we're talking 24/7. Then, the coroner themselves actually supervises the entire investigation. This all leads to a formal inquest, which is basically a court hearing, to officially figure out how the person died. And here's the key part. It can end with recommendations to change policies and procedures to hopefully stop it from happening again. It's a system built not just to find facts, but to force things to get better.
Okay, so we've got the theory down. Now let's see how this all plays out in the real world. To do that, we have to turn to the really disturbing case of John Wayne Glover. His story, from his horrific crimes all the way to his death in prison, gives us a powerful and pretty stark example of this entire process in action. Just imagine this. For 14 straight months, Sydney's affluent North Shore was absolutely gripped by fear. Glover was targeting elderly women, attacking them with brutal violence, often right in their own homes. The media gave him that infamous nickname, the Granny Killer, a name that just spread terror across the city and really came to define the whole case in the public's mind.
But here's the thing. Behind that sensationalist nickname were real women with real lives. Gwendolyn Mitchell-Hill, she was 82. Lady Winfreda Ashton, 84. Margaret Pahood, 85. Olive Cleveland, 81. Muriel Falconer, 93. And Joan Sinclair, 60. It's so important that we remember their names, not just the label that was given to their killer.
So Glover was eventually caught, right? He was convicted and sentenced to 6 concurrent life sentences. And for years, that was pretty much the end of the public story. But his death in prison meant that one final legal chapter had to be written, that mandatory death in custody inquest we've been talking about. And that's exactly what happened. At 72 years old, John Wayne Glover took his own life in his maximum security cell. With that act, his case officially became a death in custody, and that whole coronial system we discussed was immediately set into motion. So the inquest happens, and it documents the circumstances of his final days. He was being held in a segregated cell. Turns out a TV show all about his crimes had aired just a few weeks before his death. Other inmates had reported seeing him praying and thought he seemed remorseful. After looking at all the evidence, the coroner finished the inquest without making any new recommendations. Basically, they felt the prisoner had already addressed the issues at hand. The system had run its course.
But see, the legal process is only one part of the story. The way we remember these events, the words we use, that shapes the victim's legacy long after the files are closed. And it brings up a really crucial question. How do we make sure the victim, not the killer, stays at the center of the story?
And this headline, wow, it just says it all. When the author Karen Warren was researching the famous artist Sir Will Ashton, this was the only article she could find about his wife.
Lady Winfreda Ashton, one of Glover's victims, was just reduced to 2 labels, her connection to a famous man and her connection to her murderer. That's it.
Just look at this contrast. It is so stark. On one side, you have the label impersonal, generic. It just erases her individuality. And on the other side, the actual person, Lady Winifred Ashton, a nurse with her own history, her own adventures, her own identity, completely separate from both her famous husband and her killer. The language we use, especially in headlines, can so easily flatten an entire life into a single tragic data point.
And this desire, this need to restore their humanity, is what drove Warren to write her novel, The Underhistory. She uses fiction to explore the lives that the headlines just ignore, to give these women back a sense of agency that goes beyond their final moments. It's such a powerful reminder that, while the legal system might close a file, the real work of remembering and remembering them correctly, well, that falls to us.
So at the end of the day, this all leaves us with a really critical question. The Coronial Inquest can give us the official answers about a death, but it's the stories we choose to tell, in the news, in books, in our own collective memory, that truly determine how a life is remembered. Those stories have the power to either keep the killer's narrative alive or to reclaim the legacy of the victim. Which story are we going to choose to tell?